Welcome to the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. This is a podcast about understanding people better, why they do the things they do. You can learn more about it at behaviorpodcast.com. That's behavior-podcast.com. Today's episode, recorded August 5th, 2021, will be a second interview with recently retired police captain James Mitchell. We'll talk about the factors that are contributing to the issue of American police being so much more violent and deadly than their counterparts in other countries. We attempt to answer the question when we watch the latest video of an American cop doing something that seems obviously an overreaction and excessively violent. What are the factors that led to that moment? What were the factors that influenced that cop to behave that way? What may make James interesting to some people is that he's politically liberal. Also, I'll say he strikes me as being very transparent and honest in talking about his career and about the good and bad things he's seen in policing. Before I get to the interview, I thought it might be a good time to talk about what my reasons are for the political and topical issues I've been covering with this podcast. Why am I covering such controversial topics? Why am I talking about transgender issues and police violence issues and political polarization dynamics? The goal of this podcast is to increase understanding of other people. And that includes people who are doing things that are hard for us to understand. It includes people whose behavior may seem reprehensible to us. This was from the beginning a podcast about understanding human behavior, and it hasn't changed. If we really want to understand human behavior, we have to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to recognize how all of us are the product of our environment, of many factors around us, of the things that have come before us. And the reason I focus on these things is because I think attempting to understand other people and see the world through their eyes is more important than ever before. Because our world these days seems increasingly alienating and divisive, especially as the US and many other countries seem to be going through pretty well understood polarization dynamics, and empathy is increasingly hard to come by. What I'm not trying to do with this podcast is convince anyone of any specific views or opinions of mine or of my guests. To me, the reason for these tough discussions I'm doing is only partly about the issues themselves. Much more important to me is the discussion itself. To me, it's much more about the meta topic of attempting to see the factors that may be behind why other people behave and speak the way they do, of being able to see the factors that are affecting the people we view as our political enemies. To be specific, in today's interview, when I express an opinion about a police issue or about a racial issue, my goal is not to convince you of my opinion, because honestly, I'm far from an expert on most of the things I talk to people about, and I don't think I have the power to convince you of my opinion, even if that was my goal. And I don't think my guest has the power to convince you of his opinion either. But my goal is to show you how there can be well-meaning and legitimate arguments on many sides of the police violence issue, and in other podcasts about other issues, to show how complex these topics can be. And so if my podcast makes you think about topics from different points of view, it's achieved its goal. And I see that goal as very much relating to understanding human behavior. You can't understand behavior without trying to see other people's points of view. And in turn, I see understanding and empathizing with others as key to reducing the destructive us versus them polarization dynamics we're facing. Because simply attempting to see other perspectives on issues, seeing how even people on your own side can have a range of opinions, that itself can bring down anger, which in turn can reduce the us versus them, good versus evil, apocalyptic mindsets on both sides, which to me is the root problem we're dealing with here. And I think to many people, attempting to see other people's points of view and seek common ground is considered weakness, because there can be a feeling that acknowledging that the quote other side may have some valid points, or even that you can see what they're saying, is akin to letting them win the argument in some way, that it gives them strength. But it shouldn't be viewed that way. Understanding your political opponents better in no way prevents you from working towards your political goals. I'd argue that it makes you more likely to accomplish your goals by knowing the terrain, by speaking more persuasively, by looking for those spots to find common ground to accomplish what you want. In short, I think understanding people and having empathy for them grants you a lot of power. It doesn't deprive you of power. So back to the interview. A little bit about James Mitchell. Up until last year, he was a captain for the Prince George's County Police Department in Maryland. In our first talk from earlier this year, we talked about the same topic, about trying to understand the factors behind a high amount of violence of American cops. I'd wanted to get through many factors, but we ended up only touching on a couple in that first interview, with the focus being on, one, what James sees as the primary solution for these problems, which is more consistent policing standards across the country. Two, the role of mental health issues on this problem. And three, the role of police officers' approach, for example, being too aggressive, and how that can affect what happens in an encounter, and be the key to whether an incident is violent or not. So that was all in the first talk. In that talk, we didn't get a chance to talk about racism or about the impact of guns, or about the fact that juries seldom convict cops, or about police unions. So with today's interview, I wanted to touch on each of these topics for 5 to 10 minutes each and cover a bunch of ground. And for the topics we don't touch on, including mental illness and de-escalation techniques, you should check out that first interview. And if you're interested in the backstory of how I know James from high school or hearing him explain how he went from college into a policing career, that's also in there too. Another thing about James that may make him a better than average person to talk about race-related effects and outcomes is that one of the things he worked on during his time as police captain was a report on racial disparities and enforcement rates in his county. This was a project done in collaboration with Data Collaborative for Justice at John Jay College. The project was called the Research Network on Misdemeanor Justice, and it sought to inform criminal justice practitioners about lower-level enforcement activities in their jurisdictions. The name of the peer-reviewed paper they put together was Tracking Enforcement Rates in Prince George's County, Maryland, 2006 to 2018. And one of the things it did was examine racial disparities in arrest rates and how those have changed over time. And that paper was the product of research conducted in a partnership between the Prince George's County Police Department and the University of Maryland's Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. If you're curious about that, I'll put a link to that paper in the entry for this episode at behavior-podcast.com. And it might be worthwhile to point out, too, when I hear James talk about racism and its role in the equation of police violence, it hopefully goes without saying that neither of us are denying that racism exists or denying that it's a problem. But we are discussing how much of a problem it is, where it fits into the broader scheme of other factors that are at work. Because as you may know, there are some people, including some very influential people, who speak as if racism is clearly the primary problem here. And I think for anyone who's looked into the police violence issue in an in-depth way, they'll know that there are many factors present here, that the problem can be looked at from multiple angles, and that aligning on simple narratives is tough to do. Also, something worth mentioning that some people might not know, which I think is very relevant to these issues. Minority support for Donald Trump increased substantially between the 2016 election and the 2020 election. For example, black voters went from about 8% Trump support to around 10 to 12%. In the 2016 election, about 13% of Muslim American voters voted for Trump, and it was about 35% in 2020. And many political analysts think one reason for this growth is the abolish the police and abolish prisons type of talk from liberals and the associated protests and riots. And I say this to point out, if you think these are simple issues, if you think Trump support is only or even mainly about white supremacy, or if you think that cops are just bad and we need to burn the whole system down and start over again, you might want to question whether you're reaching for some very simplistic narratives about what's going on. Simple narratives are appealing, but most things are pretty complicated. For example, clearly there are many minority communities and poor communities with high crime, and many people in those communities very much want a police presence and want policing. We talked more about that topic in the first interview, but I wanted to mention it again here. Okay, here's the interview with James Mitchell, retired police captain. Hey James, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for joining me again to talk about some tough, controversial topics. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
Okay, so let's start out with, I was going to go through a few topics, spend a few minutes on each. And the one I wanted to start with was the subject of guns. And obviously we have a huge amount of guns in the US, and that leads to various other effects, like police being more scared when they're doing their job compared to their European counterparts, things like that. So I'm curious, in your experience, what role does the huge number of guns we have in this country play in police violence issues?
I think it plays in all of the issues with police, because just the sheer amount of number of guns available, and especially now that more and more are becoming readily available, untraceable ghost guns. That's been a big news topic lately. And the fact you can 3D print and make firing devices out of things that you can make at home with publicly available information on the internet. But going back, well, 21 years since I began my training, when I entered into a police academy, focus on guns from day one was always in the forefront. Whether it was learning, the time spent on learning a service weapon, proper use, the policies, the procedures, the gun range, everything, retention, exercises, you name it. There's a lot of focus on it, and there's a lot of focus on it for a very good reason, because of the amount of guns in the hands of people who will do harm to others and to police. And the number of officers killed in the line of duty by gunfire every year substantiates it. So there's a lot of of apprehension. It's the scariest part of the job. If anyone tells you anything different, that driving with your lights and sirens on is the scariest, no, they're lying to you. The fear of being shot or shot at, and even having to pull your own weapon and use it, is always it was at the forefront of getting ready for every shift every day for 20 years.
It's not just fear of other people's guns, because you also have to be afraid of your own gun being taken away. That's a big thing too?
Absolutely, it is. There have been studies done, and I can't quote them right now, and that's something we might be able to delve into later topics. If an officer loses control of their service weapon in, say, a ground fight, or a hand-to-hand fight with a combative person who's trying to take their gun away, if they succeed in taking the gun away, there's a 90% chance they will kill the officer with it when that encounter is done. And it's usually not just running away. I don't want to be quoted on that percentage figure, but it's I believe it's in the 90s.
Fair to say that when you were policing on the street, that fear was pretty high in your mind. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in everything that you did when you got dressed in the morning, and how you put your uniform on, and the position, exactly where the holster was on the side of your belt, depending on which uniform you were wearing for that day, and what kind of car you were driving. That's always a factor. Like, there's always a mind on the gun. When you're encountering, you're just talking to people on the street, citizens, community members, keeping your weapon, out of an accessible range, out of access to people, even in the calmest of situations, is something that you are always taught to be mindful of. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I know I always did. It's a position of where I'm right-handed. My service weapon was always on my right hip, slightly forward because of the way that my arm moves to a draw. Some people like it a little bit further back. But where I would rest my elbow and how I would position myself in a crowd of people was something that was always on my mind. It was always on my mind every day that I went to work. There wasn't a day that I forgot about it.
Personally, for me, I think that guns are the main issue here when it comes to excessive police violence, and I'm curious if you would agree with that.
Not necessarily. I could argue other points that precipitate police violence, and then the gun becomes the go-to. I think it starts with the approach, and in many respects of a reason of why you're stopping somebody, a reason of why you're investigating, and how well the officer is at handling a situation, their level of confidence that they have in their own skills, to handle a situation a different way.
Yeah, and we talked about that a good amount in the last episode, mm-hmm. I'd say. And I wanted to ask, I mean, obviously there can be relatively untrained and bad cops, not that well-trained cops in Europe and mm-hmm. in the US. To me, it seems like the main factor is the cops here being more afraid of guns and violence versus, their counterparts in Europe. Because it would seem to me that the European cops wouldn't be that much more well-trained to explain the huge discrepancy in violence. But I'm curious what you think of that.
It's true. I mean, I live in Portugal now, and I see police. It's a major European city. You see police everywhere. They have sidearms here, but they don't wear body armor, and that's really telling when it comes to the level of fear that they're going to get shot at or shot at work. I haven't seen it yet, except for the specialty tactical SWAT type groups, and those are the only ones I've seen in Portugal that are actually wearing anything like that. And in fact, here they wear their polo shirts with their uniform. They do have a gun and some less lethal things on their belt, because of course I notice those things. But you can see in the mannerisms of how officers patrol in Europe as opposed to the United States, it's a lot more relaxed here because they don't have the level of gun violence prevalent. They don't have shooting incidents that happen, at least in Lisbon anyway, or actually in Portugal, that you have in the United States. I think since I've been here, I think I've seen on the news 2 incidents, mm-hmm. in it's almost 6 months of living here.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to get onto another topic, but I'll wrap it up by mm-hmm. saying, obviously it's debatable about how big a role guns play, but I think it seems like it's a bigger role than is acknowledged in the general public, and seems like it's a significant role of some sort, even if, obviously we can debate what it is.
Yeah. Gun in the United States, guns and the fear of guns and the fear of officer safety because of guns, it's absolutely one of the biggest factors. If the amount of guns in the United States was, cut in half, it would still be too many, and too many on the street and too many in the wrong hands. But yeah, guns are the number one. I would say are the number one factor in a United States officer's mind of their fear and their fear of being safe at work. Absolutely, I would agree with you with that.
Okay, the next one I want to talk about was, it seems that juries don't convict cops, and that seems to be a well-known, acknowledged thing. And I know that you weren't on the legal side so much, but I'm curious if you have thoughts about how big a factor that is, the fact that if juries don't convict cops, because obviously it's easy to have one person not want to convict a cop for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you see that playing a role in like how that trickles down to, prosecutors being less willing to prosecute, and then that maybe makes, less force to solve the issue on the police side, things like that.
This is a good topic, and I'm not sure if it's not going to be consistent throughout the United States. It's going to be different in areas of states of, how juries are comprised of the constituency of an area. So there are certain places where cops never want to face a jury because of, past relationships. I know where I worked in Prince George's County, Maryland, there were officers who were on trial who chose not to have a jury trial and chose to have a bench trial by a judge because they were absolutely convinced that a jury would absolutely go after them. And you'll have in other parts of the country where you have, I don't know if we can talk about socioeconomic factors when it comes to making up a jury, but if you think about some communities that are very pro-police, juries are going to sway in what their beliefs are, in my opinion. And in some places where the opinion of police is low, I think they're more apt to convict. And places where they have a very low tolerance for crime and criminals, when there is an officer accused of wrongdoing and there's enough probable cause and evidence to bring a case against an officer forward, in my opinion, I think juries are less likely to go after the officer.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that trickles down, say, and if you're in a region where that you're more likely to not be prosecuted or not be convicted, do you feel like that has a role in making cops maybe a bit more not as self-enforcing, not as restricted in their behavior?
Well, yeah. If you have officers justifiably convicted of wrongdoing, what got the incident to that level is going to be examined, even in the trial leading up to it. I haven't ever seen a trial with a police officer accused of criminal misconduct in an event where training wasn't brought up. The agency is always brought into it. And if you have an officer who's on trial for, say, excessive force, murder, you name it, anything, misconduct in office, different things like that. If the officer's convicted, yeah, it has a huge effect in policy, procedure, and local laws. Mm-hmm. Because usually following a criminal proceeding against an officer, if there's a guilty finding, there's going to be an ensuing civil trial for money. It goes hand in hand. Sometimes it's one before the other, and usually it's the civil trial starts to come about after the criminal trial, because if an officer is found guilty, I mean, it's really all of the proof that you need in a civil trial, and that costs police departments and local governments a lot of money. Money talks. We all know this in every sense of the word, that if it's going to cost money, changes are going to be made. And
that's what it seems to me it's so obviously complex in terms of how just the sheer willingness, our jury system in general and the variations across the country are a big role in forcing those changes. And I think a lot of people don't realize that complexity. It's like a lot of this is based on the sheer fact that we have this jury system, and that it is hard to convict cops, and that trickles down in all these sorts of ways.
And there's also the convictions. Convicting cops accused of criminal misconduct is going to be different from state to state, based on the laws. Law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights that I know existed in Maryland. which has now changed as of June 1st or July 1st of this year. There are a lot of changes that have been made to that, and positive changes in some respect, and some that make officers nervous in other respects, that where they weren't as protected before. I mean, police work is messy in a lot of respects, and it's also rewarding in a lot of respects. And a lot of it is community based, and a lot of it is, dealing with a criminal element who is truly out to do a community and officers harm. And it's hard to balance between the two of those, where the happy middle ground is. In that middle ground, there are people that are not going to be happy. So, getting back to the point of of the juries, there are places where it is hard, really hard, based on local laws, to convict officers. It's definitely skewed to protect an officer. And where the origins of those laws came from, I don't know. It was before my time in policing, but I know in many, many places they're changing now because they feel there's too much protection in it. And in a lot of cases, and a lot of places, you can see it as well, where there are the bad cops who have bad intentions getting away with things time after time. And a lot of it has to do also with how the prosecutorial system is made in some jurisdictions and how charges are brought against officers. Places that use grand juries to examine an entire event and bring charges to an officer based on evidence presented in front of them in an indictment, I believe generally have a higher outcome of guilty findings against an officer. And if you have a place where it's just the prosecutor bringing it forward or not bringing it forward, in a lot of places, the elected district attorneys, state's attorneys, local attorneys, the ones that are elected, a lot of them can interpret the law the way they want and not even bring the charges to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this kind of gets back to some points you were making in our first talk, where you were talking a lot about the variability, the fact that so many rules and guidelines and laws are so different across the country, and not having those standardized is a big role. So I wanted to move on to the next topic, which was a lot of people mentioned the role of the police unions, how the strength of the unions helps protect cops, and in a similar way to the jury topic, may take some pressure off cops or police departments to, have more guidance or restrictions on their behavior. I'm curious what you think of the role of police unions and all of this.
As far as the role, I worked in an agency that had a union, and for the first 17 years of my career, I was actively in the union. But moving and promoting to a different level at a certain rank, you can buy back into it for legal protection should you need it, but your pay is not bargained by a union. The unions set out to protect officers' rights as far as, and it's multifaceted. The unions are not there just to protect cops in court, but they do pay for the attorneys that defend them, and they pay a lot of money for that, and they do pay for good attorneys. So the unions are. Some people think they're the devil. Some people think that they're the way to go. As far as unions, they're to support officers against their local government officials as far as working conditions, pay, benefits, things like that. I think they're absolutely fantastic. It's a lower paid profession to begin with, and we know what happens when you take a profession that has such low pay to begin with and try to keep it government budgets down that way. It's a hard role to dance. Now the unions also, even if an officer has done something egregious, like shot a handcuffed person in a police car and there's no explanation for it, no video, nothing, they're still going to, and under the rules of the union, provide the officer with an attorney. It doesn't mean that the union backs their actions, but what they're going to do is make sure that they get the due process that they're entitled to. Unions in the Northeast are a lot stronger than I in my belief and opinion, than anywhere else in the country. You take, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, all have very, very strong politically connected police unions. And I'm sure, and I couldn't really go into depth with how that affects it, but I'm sure that the unions do play a role in just how misconduct unfolds in under public examination in a courtroom.
Yeah, it seems like there's so many ways to look at this. You can look at it from the point of view of unions do protect workers' interests, and
Hmm.
especially if it's a lower paying job, there's plenty of reasons you would expect to have a union. But then I
Hmm.
was reading other things saying like, well, we don't expect the military doesn't have a union for various reasons because it's such a deadly job that
Yeah.
we expect more restrictions and authority in place. So it seems like there's a range of ways to look at it, and all I know for certain is it's pretty complicated and for me to determine what the best solution is.
Yeah, I'll add one quick point to that. The public perception of police is almost around the country. And I don't want to I use the word uneducated, but just unaware. A large percentage of the people in the United States are not aware just how vastly different organizations, unions, and all in their local jurisdictions are made. And that it's really, you can draw general comparisons to policing around the country, but when it comes to how misconduct is handled, investigated, prosecuted, it would really, really benefit people to get very involved in their local states and counties to understand just how it works, because it's going to be vastly different from state to state. There's no one body governing how policing works
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, and that's something that everyone needs to be aware of when they are looking for change in their local organization. Like, okay, how does our organization work? The one that we're paying our taxes to, and getting involved on a more grassroots local level, I believe, for people who are seeking change, it's more than just talking in front of a news camera. It's actually learning about your local laws and working with legislators to change them. Or the trickle down can take too long, and lives can be lost if there's something that's not working, codified in law.
That's the thing I see a lot is people comparing what happens in one area with another area, whether it's
Hmm.
police or just law in general, and the disparity is just so huge. So it's just so hard to compare what happens in one region jurisdiction to another jurisdiction just in general.
If there's one thing that I could tell to people in the United States, like, imagine that every state is a different country and is going to operate differently. Keep that in your mind, and really examine what's going on in your state, your county, and your municipal level
Mhm.
of what is on the books and what works and what does not work by a community standard and by a policing governance board. These things are all vastly different, and if there's one big takeaway is that there's nothing in the United States that is identical. Nothing.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, I want to get to the next topic, which was the big one, racism. And so when some listeners listened to the first interview, their big question was, that was a good interview, but let's talk more about the role of racism. So I wanted to give a pretty long preamble here because I feel like there's some gotchas and language issues that can get in the way of talking about this. So I wanted to break down, before I ask you the question, I'm going to break down what I see as the main areas in this area. So the three things I see to talk about are: one, racist individuals; two, systemic racism, aka institutional racism; and three, the effects of past racism. And so I'm going to go into those a little bit. So first, we've got racist people, racist individuals, and that would be cops or leaders changing decisions based on racism and discrimination. That would include behavior like being more likely to use force if a person is black, being more likely to pull someone over if they're black. Worth pointing out here too, that can range from the more explicit racism to the less realized, more unconscious forms of racism, the kinds of things people do where they don't know they're being unfairly biased. So next we've got systemic racism, also referred to as institutional racism. And this blends a bit, I think, with the racism of individuals, but the definition of systemic racism, as it's officially defined, is about laws and policies that are racist.
Hmm.
So to read the Wikipedia entry, it says institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, is a form of racism that's embedded through laws and regulations within a society or an organization. And some people would say that some specific aspects of the war on drugs, for example, were racist in how they seemed to target black people, or that certain drug crime sentencing guidelines seem purposely racist. But sometimes I think this can become hard to talk about because systemic racism blends a bit with the racism of individuals. For example, many studies have shown that black drivers are more likely to be pulled over by police, and many people point to things like that as an indicator of systemic racism. But then you could also look at that and chalk it up to individual racist cops and say that's not systemic racism as it's usually defined. But from the other side, you could say, as an entity, as an organization with a lot of power, one would think police departments bear responsibility for trying to eliminate egregious forms of bias and discrimination. So if it's known, for example, that racial profiling is a common tactic and nothing's done about it, that's kind of on the organization responsibility wise, just as much as if they had an official policy about it. That's one way to look at it. So I think this overlap, the ambiguity between the racism of individuals and systemic racism, is one reason why these things can be a bit hard to talk about, because an organization can always defend itself by saying, well, that's just the actions of individuals and we can't stop that, which to an extent is true, but it's also true that people expect a lot of responsibility from organizations that have a lot of power. So that's the first two categories. And then the third one would be effects of historical racism. And that would include things like the fact that past racism and discrimination against Black people and other minorities means that now those people are more likely to be poor, more likely to live in high crime neighborhoods, more likely to commit crime. It's important to point out that this alone could theoretically explain a lot of the disparities in outcomes that are often pointed to as egregious differences in outcomes, like the fact that Black people have many more encounters with cops on a statistical basis. And what strikes me in this area too is that many people call these things systemic racism when they actually seem to be referring to, or could theoretically be referring to, the effects of past racism. So in a similar way that it's hard to separate the ideas of individual racism and systemic racism, I think it can be hard to separate systemic racism from past effects of racism.
Yeah.
Again, this isn't to say that racism is not a problem or doesn't exist, but I think it's to point out that many people conflate these ideas when they're talking about them, pointing out things like Black people are having worse outcomes, and that therefore that in itself is a sign of systemic racism. And I see that a lot in articles. Like when I was researching before this, I saw a Vox article about systemic racism, and most of the things in there just did not strike me as systemic racism, as it's usually defined, as it's technically defined. And so I think a big part of this ambiguity or confusion, I realize, is also about the fact that systemic, the word, can be used as a general adjective. The general definition of systemic is just relating to a system. So I think that it helps explain why people are using the language differently, even though the technical definition is about like laws and policies. If you're using it in a more general sense, you can be like, I'm saying it's systemic racism because it's just part of the system that I'm describing, even if it's just about individual actions or whatever, or past historical actions. They're just lumping a lot of things together under that category, even though that may not be the usual technical definition. And that was a big realization for me, just how much the language makes this hard to talk about. Just a quick note here. These subjects are very hard to talk about as there are so many factors and overlapping aspects. And obviously, it's also a sensitive subject. So I wanted to point out that my attempt here to distinguish between systemic racism and past effects of racism was about things currently happening versus things that have already happened. If I could do it over again, I might have called it current systemic racism versus past effects of all types of racism. In other words, I fully recognize that systemic racism has definitely existed in extreme forms in the US, and that it may still exist in various forms in the present. I mainly wanted to distinguish between past and present here. Okay, back to the interview. With that long preamble, I'm wondering, when it comes to these questions, when it comes to racism, either behaviors by individual cops or policing policies or department level biases, in your career, have you seen things in these areas that you view as explicitly racist?
Well, I would like to start with the effects of past racism. I think that has a bigger part to do with a lot of the outcomes that people see, and then moving on to actual, like, legitimately racist cops. So if you look at community dynamics in the lens of past racist actions and how communities developed and how poor majority African American communities or parts of a city, how they were set up, I think that has a lot to do with how enforcement has played out. Because if we go back in history, from the effects of past racism and the ending of slavery, the ending of
Jim Crow kind of stuff.
Jim Crow and segregation and all of that, people lived in a community that was how do I get into saying this correctly? a predominantly poor black neighborhood didn't just happen. I believe that is a byproduct of past racist events in our country, and those communities are often the ones scrutinized. If there's crime, drugs, and other problems that are deemed a problem by a government or a community as a whole, you can get into the lack of like good schools, the lack of healthcare, the lack of
Mhm.
resource, the lack of work, and all of those factors directly impact crime rates. I can actually separate this from take out the characteristic of race or color of your skin or nationality. If things like education, healthcare, basic needs aren't being met in a community, you're going to have problems. And so when you have a community that's got problems, to solve the problems, police are sent in. And you often had zero tolerance enforcement actions that were taken in those communities that were already marginalized to begin with. And so you go from the past effects of racism into a system, or I guess we could slide into the terms in systemic racism of zero tolerance, and policies that were enacted, and charging, and things related to drugs. This is just such a big thing, and
It's a huge
I
spectrum.
will.
Yeah,
It's a huge
yeah.
spectrum, and my educational history didn't focus mainly on these topics, so I don't want to act like I'm a complete expert on it,
Mhm.
because I'm definitely not. But just things that I've seen is that in poor, underserved communities where criminal acts happen because of a variety of factors, police are sent in to clean up the problem, and their tool to clean up the problem is arrest. And people doing things wrong in the eye of the law in those communities tend to be of those of minority. Whether it is an African American community that was established post Jim Crow, post slavery, and just existed, or if it is a newer community set up by an immigrant population that's often marginalized or doesn't have access to, in the same way, access to the basic needs. A majority, and oftentimes majority white community as a whole, is going to see that area as a problem. And what's the way to solve the problem? Send in the police. When you have departments that have the tunnel vision of, we're going to solve this problem by talking about the numbers of people we arrested, and how many guns we got, and how many grams of crack cocaine were seized, and how many grams of marijuana, and how many liquor law violations we could do, and call that success. In my opinion, and in my education level, that's not success. I mean, the success of fighting crime is the absence of fear of crime in a neighborhood. Departments that use systemic mechanisms to gauge their quote unquote effectiveness by using numbers and statistics, I believe are falling short of a bigger picture. And then you end up with this net widening effect of having outcomes that disproportionately affect people of color and people of different nationality.
Right. And the thing that strikes me there is, I think we can all agree that we've had a lot of problems in the past that have led to current problems. And I think the question I have is, a lot of people seem focused on the history of it, but it's like we can't change that. I mean, the problem of these things, the question to me is what to do about it now. And for example, like if a certain area in the city is high crime, we can't solve the problem of past racism by not policing that area that is high crime. I feel like a lot of times the focus is not on what can we do now, but on the past, which we cannot change.
Which we have done. Yeah, and we know that heavily policing one underserved area is going to have negative outcomes, just by the sheer number of events initiated by police. Often termed proactive policing. If the police are initiating events and the police are responding to events where people call in an area where there are more events happening, it's probability. It's basic probability of the you have a higher probability of adverse outcomes, or use of force incidents, or use of force escalation where it comes to deadly force. That's going to happen, and I would argue that happens in any area that is deemed high crime, just for the sheer number of activities that the police are engaging in one smaller area. And with that, you can have any sort of factor or any number of factor influencing the outcome. Is the outcome going to be peaceful? Is it going to lead to an arrest? Is it going to lead to a force incident that is controversial? Is it going to lead to an unarmed person being shot? There are a lot of factors that boil into that one, and there's so much to separate and analyze in attempting to fix it. Now, we could talk for days on days about the effects of old laws and what evolved as systemic racism, laws on the books that were absolutely meant to target people who were poor, people of color, or immigrants. I mean, they exist, and they exist
so many
everywhere.
Of them, yeah.
I mean, and it dates back to the ban on slavery and in peonage, when forced labor was outlawed, except in cases where people were convicted of criminal wrongdoing. And then all sorts of laws end up on the books that, in arguably, you can say that were meant to keep people of color down and oppressed. I mean, it just goes in it. Now, moving into racist cops. Yeah, I've seen racist cops. I've worked with racist cops. I didn't want to work with racist cops. The non-racist cops would distance themselves from any type of having to work together on scenes, because we knew what would happen. It would evolve into a complaint. It would evolve into a force incident. Going into that, I mean, there are white cops who are absolutely vocally racist, and that doesn't come out until after they've been on the job for a while, because everyone keeps on their best behavior while they're in training on their probationary period. From the officers who were overtly racist, where I wouldn't say they were, walking around yelling racial epithets openly, but among people who they think that they could trust, they would use racial slurs or derogatory terms referring to groups of people, among others. And I would see this, and I know that I outwardly said to somebody once, I'm like, I don't think this way. I don't think you should be really one. If you believe this, you're in the wrong line of work. Because this is not how it goes. But there's also times, and even in my own career, where I look the other way. It's not a great thing to say, and it's not a great thing to know what you did, know that you were part of that. There was one person in particular that I worked with who would set out to go to certain neighborhoods to, quote, mess with people. It happened.
If you had to rank how much of your coworkers, the fellow cops, were like that, I mean, how big a problem would you rank it as population-wise?
I would say very small, because I can only think of, honestly, 3 people in an agency of nearly 1,800 that I worked with who, when I would see them, it was just a red flag.
At least that it was on the surface, obviously.
It was on the surface, and it was like a bubbling disdain for certain types of people. Most of the people I worked with, I would say 98% of them were some of the most even-keeled, mild, or like middle-of-the-road tempered people you'd ever want to meet. And we were a diverse group: men, women, black, white, Hispanic, and Asian. I mean, there were just some of the best people I ever worked with. And the goal was, okay, we need to go out on the street and do our job. We need to make sure we're safe. We need to do things right. We always had the lazy officers who would do everything they could to avoid having to put pen to paper and write a report, or do anything to avoid getting out of their police car and approaching a person and asking a question, or trying to effectively solve a problem. And in fact, most of the things that I would say 75% of the things that we handled were not like emergency, were not violent crime related. What doesn't exist, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, is a way for officers to report racist acts by other officers in a way that affects meaningful change. It's so hard administratively, knowing from either it's because a lot of it's tied up in local and state laws, to prove that someone's racist and to a point enough to forcibly make a change or remove that person from their position. I think about it from a management perspective, and when the complaints that, oh, this officer is racist and doing racist things, too much of the focus is on, well, what was the event, what was the racist act, and can we prove it? So that is a problem in of itself. I don't think there's a way. There are now more and more increasing mechanisms and laws that are forcing mechanisms, which I think are positive changes, to report officers for criminal wrongdoing. That's showing up now. There's a duty to report law on the books in Maryland, where you have to, as an officer, if you're on a scene and something went wrong and you don't say something about it, you're liable for it. But now there's a duty and a law to report, and I think that's a good thing, because people need to be able to report the actions of bad officers. And I started to see more and more of that in I would say the last 5 years of my career with the agency I worked for, where other officers were reporting the wrongdoing of their fellow officers, because they knew, and they were newer officers reporting in some cases on newer officers as well, but on of older officers, like, this person did this, and I know this is wrong, and we were taught from the beginning that we have to say something when this is wrong. And I know specifically of 2 incidents where that type of wrongdoing was reported by fellow officers that they worked with, that resulted in convictions and jail time for the 2 officers.
Do you feel like that was a cultural shift in a similar way that we've seen, people in general more willing to speak up about bad behavior? Is that happening? Do you feel like?
Yeah, I think some of it can be attributed to generational, but a lot of this was the way that newer officers were taught were actually because of mechanisms put in place and requirements put in place and being taught in the academy. I know that when I was in the academy, we were taught to look the other way. I would say in the last 10 years, that culture shift really changed, at least where I worked, where no, you are required to report wrongdoing. While my own agency had that rule in our general order book to report wrongdoing and how to do it, now that there are laws requiring it on the state level to do it, it's a win. Mm-hmm. It's a win for an agency, it's a win for a community, and it's a win for officers who know that something's wrong to have a way to do it. And if still, I know that personally of one of the officers who reported the wrongdoing really got wrung through the ringer by their peers, but has prevailed and had stood strong by their beliefs, and is still working with that same group. This officer wasn't moved because they reported on a group on an officer that was within their working group. They're left right where they were. That officer suffered a loss of respect from some of their peers, wrongfully so, in my opinion. But some of those things tend to change over time, where people are like, yeah, I actually see why you did that. And they're like, yeah, I had to report it because I saw that this was wrong, and I don't know who could have been filming this from a distance away. And if I say nothing, I'm just as guilty, and I don't agree with this.
Well, it's getting back to your points that your great points in the first interview about how there's just this lack of consistency in policy. Like if more departments had those rules, then there'd be more accountability. And yeah, it's a great point. I wanted to get back to the racism question. Of one thing I've wondered is if racism by racist individual cops, if some of that racism might manifest in the more non-deadly uses of force, for example, more likely to get pulled over. I mean, there's studies on that show that, but also, I was thinking more likely to, punch or hit someone versus maybe those indicators, those kinds of racisms might be less likely to show up for deadly use of force because cops are more afraid of, getting caught and getting attention. So I kind of wonder do you think there might be an element of that where if you studied the less deadly elements of force, you might see actually more correlation with race there than you do in the deadly encounters, because despite lots of studies on this, the deadly force encounters, there isn't a clear link between of race being a factor there. They've studied that a lot, and it's just not a clear link that I've seen for any study. But I am curious if you think for those racist cops that you mentioned. Like it's easy for me to imagine them doing various things.
For the ones that I mentioned and the ones that I worked with, yeah, I could definitely see that. It would just, they were more likely to be involved in a use of force incident, whether and enough force that it was actually justified under the rules at the time. But it's all in their approach, whether the officer's racist or just mean or has a authority complex where they think they're better than everyone else. There's a lot of that personality factors into a lot. Whether they're just overtly racist or they're
aggressive,
very, very hot-headed and aggressive. I do believe that racism does play a role in non-deadly use of force situations.
Well, I was going to say, that just strikes me the complexity in this area, because as you're saying, an officer's approach, like if somebody's more aggressive, you can imagine that having racial outcome differences, just that alone, whether they're racist or not. So for example, if an officer is more likely to be aggressive and take an aggressive approach, there's certain demographic things there that can lead to that having worse outcomes with Black people. And that people might point to those statistics, like the fact that officers are more likely to use force. But that doesn't necessarily due to any inherent racism. It could just be for demographic reasons, and also for the fact that our country is increasingly polarized around these issues. So it's easy to imagine a cultural thing of, Black people feeling more oppressed and being more willing to object in various ways. It just strikes me that there's so many factors here that can influence these things that are not even due to explicit racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to do that is if we're talking about a kind of a big dreaming overview of this could actually even happen, but is examining each officer's their work actions over the course of a period of time. You take into how many use of force incidents they were involved in, the demographical information about the people that they had the encounters with. So you could go, based on race, age, nationality, any other factor, and then compare each individual's enforcement and their activity over a period of time to the communities that they police. What is the demographic makeup of the area? So if you, for instance, have an officer who's had, 5 use of force incidents over the period of 12 months, and you see the number of citations they've written, and then do a scientific analysis of who was on the receiving end of this officer's work action, and you see that they work in a neighborhood that is, say 75% white, 25%, 20% African American, and 5% Hispanic, and you see that all enforcement action over the entire 12-month span is taken on Hispanic people, and the majority of all their workload is their work productivity, which is measurable based on the actions that they do. And each person who was on the other end of the interaction with the officer is of one race, age, or ethnic group, then you can really point to a problem.
A quick note here. I realized after the interview that I missed an important follow-up and should have asked him about policies that he's seen that he would categorize as racist. I sent him this question, and we'll try to add his response in this episode's blog post at behavior-podcast.com. But obviously, no matter what, this is a very cursory examination of these issues, and James is just one person. And as James said in our first interview, we could talk about these topics for weeks and still be only part of the way there to understanding all the factors involved. Back to the interview. Okay, yeah, let's move on to maybe really quickly. People have talked about cops living outside the areas they police in. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how big a factor you think that is, because it seems to me it'd be pretty hard to expect all or most cops to live in the area they police in. It seems like a pretty unrealistic expectation, especially for the tougher neighborhoods. But I'm curious what you think of that idea.
I've seen a difference personally in actions and words of officers who lived in the areas where, well, I wouldn't say so. I lived in the jurisdiction where I worked for my entire career. I never lived outside of it, but I did not patrol in the neighborhood where I lived. I patrolled in 2 different geographical areas, and they generally try to keep officers out of their own neighborhoods. One for just so the officer can live life as a private citizen without being so well known or be targeted for
Right.
retribution or retaliation, or to keep lazy officers from sitting at their house during their entire shift and not doing any work. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons why they would
Right.
do
Just
that.
it would seem, yeah, it would seem awkward just in general. Like you'd always be on the job if everybody around you was always seeing you as a cop.
Yeah, I mean, and it was enough that in my neighborhood when I had a marked police car, I would have people knock on my door asking me questions at 9 o'clock at night. I'm like, I have to be at my day shift, and I'm sure there's an on duty officer that can help you, but I had somebody knock on my door once complaining about another officer. I'm like, what part of this told you that my residence was the complaint department? Things like that, and you have to answer them in a you can't be a complete jerk, but you just want to say, get the F off my porch and go deal with this another time. But at the same respect, you can't be that guy. You're not supposed to be that guy. So it's good not to. I believe it's good not to patrol in the area where you live. One, because it's. I just think it was a better fit for me. There are other officers who love to patrol the areas where they live because they're very tight knit with their community. There was one that I knew that worked in a northern district, and she lived north, and she knew everybody and grew up there, and that was a good fit for her. But she was still very productive. She still did a lot of crime fighting, but she did a lot of community things too. So I mean, there isn't one rule against that, but generally, a department is going to keep somebody from patrolling exactly where they live. It might be the same patrol district, but it'll be the other end of it. But there is a general disparity between the officers who live and work in the same place and the ones who just work there and live somewhere else. I've seen it. You see it in the attitude, you see it in the approach. Like, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just here to work. Whereas others were like, no, I actually live here.
Yeah, let's get to the one more topic, the war on drugs kind of topic, where it's kind of a subset of the systemic racism topics, because a lot of people would say that the war on drugs policies and kind of related overreach related to that are a big part of the problem. For example, no knock warrants, which seem particularly egregious, seem like an outshoot of the war on drugs stuff. So I'm curious how you see the war on drugs specifically, or related topics as playing a role in police, violence by police.
So, war on drugs, I mean, most of that stuff started when we were both very young. You'd say 80s, 90s, the crack cocaine epidemic, mandatory minimum sentences, and things like that. I can tell you that it was very common for investigative units around the world in police departments or even on the federal level to target those who they know were running out of strikes on mandatory minimum sentences. Now, and the no-knock warrants, I think we need to separate that conversation, because there's a lot of answers to no-knock warrants, and I believe all of it has to do with how well a case is investigated, and that has so much to do with expertise level of officers, how well the investigating officers are being supervised, and how well the agency, or what safeguards the agency has in place to protect citizens from incomplete or half done investigations. No knocks, no knock warrants vary by availability from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and in my opinion, there are cases when it's absolutely necessary. In cases where you have a target of investigation who is known to actively try to assault or kill officers, or actively assault or kill other people, has priors for murder, is known to have weapons, not just there's a thought to have weapons. I think that tool may still need to exist. It's an unpopular opinion that I think it needs to still exist, but it all rests on how well that investigation's being done. And investigations take time, and there's oftentimes mounting pressure from police leadership to wrap up a case quickly. We want to talk about a closure on the news. This is a failure of leadership, in my opinion, and not just at the individual level. Is like, all right, this case needs to be done. We need a quick arrest for this. Well, you know what? You don't always get that, especially with drug and gun investigations. They're very complex. They require a lot of surveillance, and they're hard to surveil. You almost need to be certain that something's in there. You need to know who's in there, what's inside, and there's no way to completely know. But if you're knocking at the door in every circumstance, either the case is not going to get investigated and that person is still going to will be out doing crimes, or their officers are going to get hurt. That I believe there still needs to be, but I believe that no knock warrants are oftentimes used incorrectly, and are oftentimes approved when an investigation is completely inadequate.
It's like a dead end. Like they're kind of desperate. Yeah.
Yeah, they're desperate to get it done, and they've just done a bad job, and the supervisor's not paying enough attention. I've seen this myself. There's so many factors that make so the Breonna Taylor case. That is not just one problem with a police agency. That's like a plane crash where it's a lot more things that went wrong that ended in this deadly situation. And I believe that when police agencies fail in this manner, it needs to be investigated. The failure needs to be investigated like similar to a plane crash, because it's not just one thing.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to the war on drugs aspect, the thing that strikes me in that area is I think a lot of people think of it or talk about it as if it was something that white people did, but it's worth pointing out that that there were a lot of black leaders back then who were behind these policies. And I was looking at a book yesterday called Locking Up Our Own, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. It was by James Forman, and it was about the black leaders who were behind. They were trying to solve the problem of high crime and the crack epidemic and stuff. So I think that's worth pointing out, just if we're talking about the subject of race too.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, so I got into law enforcement probably about 10 years after those laws and war on drugs really started to take effect through the nation. But like a war on something is going to have an unintended consequence, and an unintended consequence can be that this is going to target just what is the prevalently seen problem or prevalently perceived problem. And there's always blanket laws that give no room for interpretation, and no room for
nuance,
for any sort of nuance. They're going to have a net casting effect, and they're going to round up a particular person, place, or group, and you're going to see a disparity. Because if you're going, you didn't see crack use prevalent in white upper middle class suburbia. It was the violence associated with crack sales and all of that in the late 80s and 90s was all in poorer Black and Hispanic communities. But you could have a war on any sort of crime that affects one group. If you did a war on moonshiners, who are you going to affect?
Right. Yeah. Like there's definitely like different populations, like the Appalachian, sort of specific crime specific to that region. And
if you before a policy is made to declare a war on anything, if they're declaring a war on a problem, who does that problem affect? I mean, who does it affect the most? What can we predict would be the ugly consequences of a policy like that?
Well, I think it's getting back to that topic of, historical effects of racism versus current systemic racism. If you're trying to solve an actual problem that affects one group more than another group, by definition, that group will be more impacted, no matter who they are. Like you said, moonshiners, or, the meth and opiate trade in the Appalachian Mountains or whatever. If you're trying to solve a problem, some group will be impacted more than others. And I think that gets back to the main problem for me around how people talk about this without that nuance, of just because, X group is affected more, than there is by definition something malicious going on. Whereas there's many problems that people are actually actively trying to solve, like black leaders were trying to solve the crack epidemic problem and crime epidemic problem. Everybody was trying to solve that problem. And you may argue that some of those things were overreaching or unfair in various ways. Obviously, I believe, I do believe many of those things were, but the point is, if you're trying to solve a problem, by definition, someone's going to be impacted by that more than other people. Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end it. Thanks a lot for coming on, James. I appreciate your perspectives and sharing your experiences.
Thanks for having me again. These are not easy topics to talk about, but I'm always willing to give an opinion or a perspective from my 20 years in law enforcement, and hoping that we have some sort of positive changes coming through, and at least positive discourse on very, very difficult topics.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, to me, it's all about the conversation. Like, I don't think we're going to solve anything here, but I appreciate you being willing to discuss it. Thanks.
That was James Mitchell. Just a reminder that this was the second interview of James, and in our first talk, we discussed some factors that we didn't discuss here, including mental illness and how police are taught about hold and restraint tactics, and how they're taught about approaching and talking to people, and how they're taught about de-escalation techniques. This has been the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zachary Elwood. You can learn more about this podcast at behavior-podcast.com. And again, just a reminder that the reason I'm doing these types of podcasts is to combat political polarization, because I think we are all more alike than we know. If you want to learn more about that kind of thing, check out interviews I've done in the past about political polarization dynamics and about how Facebook may be contributing to polarization, topics like that. If you like this podcast, you can say thanks by giving me a rating on iTunes. I also appreciate shares on social media. I spend a good amount of time on this podcast, and I don't make any money from it. And honestly, I'm not so sure I'll be able to do very many episodes in the future that often. So if you want to donate some money to my endeavors, if you think I'm doing a good job, you can send me a tip via Patreon at patreon.com/Zach Elwood. That's CACHELWOOD. Thanks for listening. Music by Small Skies.